Welcome back to Roots and Relevance. Today we are on episode 3, and we are hitting Chapter 2 of, as Jonathan likes to call it, the Scroll of Esther, not the Book of
The
Esther.
Missoula, what is it?
Migdala.
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 I had the M right.
This chapter is going to be a fun one. We're going to hit everything from power dynamics to some kind of messy parts of the story in Chapter 2, and so it should be fun. We're going to do what we did last time, which is basically to take a chunk of scripture at a time and then talk through it, argue through it, have some fun with it. Let's just jump straight in. Riley, you got it?
Yeah, 1 through 4.
Yep.
Okay. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, and to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly.
All right. It jumps right into what looks like a really bad season of The Bachelor, although it's worse, I think.
No, the only thing worse than The Bachelor is Love Island. So,
Wait,
it's
so
let that be known.
how do you,
When have you
how do
seen
know
Love
that?
Island?
I've just seen promos.
What is Love Island?
It's on his DVR.
It's-
New
it's on-
and repeat episodes, please.
If you go to my Hulu, it's on continue watching.
Oh, man. All right. This episode of Esther is brought to you by Love Island and The Bachelor. I love it. So, yeah, what do we have here? What comes up for you? I mean, obviously, this is not the VeggieTales version of the story. I think I've seen the VeggieTales version.
Oh, it's
by the way.
amazing. The best VeggieTales.
Yeah, like what I know they don't do a beauty
It's a
pageant.
talent. It's a talent show.
It's a talent show. Okay, okay. I love VeggieTales. It's just the best.
Ding, Phil Vischer.
So yeah, like any issues for you in this, and the fact that you have basically a competition to see with a one night stand who's going to please the king the most? Is that?
Well, I'm just wondering, does the king have regrets for what he did to Vashti? And the king remembered Vashti and what he had done and what had been decreed against her. Maybe did I just overreact? Or is this something that is of utmost significance? Because last week we talked about, it's a little bit overboard for him to be able to just declare that this incident between he and his wife is now a kingdom-wide issue, right? We're starting to see a little bit of his insecurities here. I don't know. It's just sort of things. Every
Like
time
you
I
woke
read,
up.
yeah, like, oh my gosh, I came out of my drunken stupor. I remember what I did to my wife. I wonder if there's regret there. I don't know.
Yeah, and even the way
Well-
it says it, remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what was decided against her. I mean, it almost makes it sound like it wasn't him.
Yeah.
It's like, oh man, I'm just gonna step back. I can't believe what we decided against her.
And I'm
No
going
one
to say,
do that.
yeah, but it wasn't what he decreed against her, right? It's what was declared. Like he's like I
Right.
think John,
Like distancing himself from the decree.
decision. Yeah.
So there is a Midrash.
Of
and
course
the
there
Midrash,
is.
there is. Abba Gorian. And this is what Abba Gorian, he or she says. When he recovered from his wine, he sought her. They said to him, "You had her killed." He said to them, "Why?" And they said to him, "When you said that she should appear before you naked and she did not come." He said to them, "I didn't act correctly. Who advised me to have her killed?" And they said to him, "The 7 ministers of Persia and Media." He immediately killed them, and that is why they are not mentioned again. So, I mean, it goes to this concept we talked to think about last week, is that a lot of times when men were in a drunken state and made all these edicts and decrees, they would always wait to the next day to say, okay, we can really undo this. But he chose apparently not to undo it. And I think it's also cool that it says sometime later when his rage had cooled down. But we're not given, is this the next day? Is this a year later? Is this 6 months later? There's some commentaries that say this could be even a year later. And it's just kind of funny that it took him a year to get over his rage.
Yeah, I think in the Hebrew language, when it says sometime later, it's not talking about the next day or two.
yeah.
It's talking about like
a long period of time.
Yeah, it's usually a long period of time. So that is a little bit different thought than him waking up the next morning like the hangover, like, wait, what happened?
Why is there a tiger in my bedroom? Why is Love Island still playing on my TV?
I was going to say, I haven't watched what is the
Hangover?
The Hangover. So
Really, you didn't watch the first one?
I have not seen 1 or 2.
Oh man!
What else you got, Tim, on the rest of the verses in this section?
On the rest of the verses in that section, I do find it, Riley. I think you may have mentioned this, but like it is kind of interesting, the possibility that he's like, what have I done? Because remember, chapter 1 was his part of his punishment for Vashti was to make families great again, right? Like he did the decree of like,
oh my God,
he demanded like Southern seminary complementarianism.
Hey,
It seems a little bit more oppressive than that.
Sounds a little bit aggressive there.
I'm playing the part of it. Like Esther, I'm exaggerating for effect.
In a very truthful way, but not may have really
In a
happened.
very truthful way.
In a historical narrative way.
Exactly. But like, it's funny because the whole decree made it sound like we're going to get like our families back in order. And with what happened in chapter 1, he now is without a family. And it's like he's waking up going, oh my goodness, I don't have a family. I need to get one. And so.
And like, as we'll see as we continue through these chapters, it stays that way for years. Like, he doesn't marry Esther till like what? Like 4 years after?
4 years.
So like, this is going to be a hot second before his household is anywhere near where it should be as the Persian king.
Good. Anything else in that chapter before we go to verses 5 through 11?
Yes. So did they have a choice when it says, so that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins? Were they obtained or were they volunteered?
Well,
yes. I don't think there's a difference between volunteered and attained, actually. So I think.
Oh, you don't think so?
Well, I think there's a difference. There's a difference between, I'll go see the king, and there's a difference between like a king's guardsman coming in like, you're gonna go see the king. Like, that's not the same thing at all. So I think that it's an important distinction.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, like, the power dynamics, I think we're going to talk about as we go throughout this chapter, maybe throughout this book. But Jonathan, one of your boys, Michael V. Fox, pointed this out, that the verb for to take in Hebrew is lakah, and it's used 3 different times in relation to Esther in the chapter. Mordecai takes her in as a daughter. She is taken to the palace, and then she is taken to the king. And so it's very much like she's like an object. And I know that's one of the things we want to talk about, right? Is like, how much of a choice did Esther have in this? And I think that's going to become even more important as we go on through that.
We could probably say that not all virgins were brought to the king, right? Only right.
It's just like American Idol, like, you sing really bad. You're like, I'm sorry, this competition is not for you.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I'm assuming that there are some virgins that say, hey, I'd love to be the queen and all that stuff. But
Simon Cowell is there, like Hebrew Simon Cowell or Persian Simon Cowell is like there. Yeah, it's not going to work out for you.
Yes. So when we have this picture of, them coming and dragging all the virgins, no, they're not doing that. They're picking
getting the best of the best.
That's right.
Right.
Right. I mean, we can agree on that, right?
I think so. That's just kind of common sense, right? Like they're not bringing everybody.
I think the qualifier was beautiful virgins, beautiful young virgins. So,
I mean, can you imagine if the word gets out and like you're either the father or you are one of the young virgins that this is going out? My question is like, do you dress up or do you dress down for like when the group's coming by to check you out? Like, are you like wanting to go?
Don't brush your hair. Don't put on any makeup.
Watch the morning breath and say it right in their face.
Yeah, but it says clearly in the end of verse 3, put them under the supervision of. You said it better than I did, Riley. Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. So I don't think they had a choice here. I think they were, this is what you're going to do to your hair. This is what you're going to do to your makeup. This is what you're going to do to your dress. I don't think they were given the opportunity. And then they're paraded in front of the king and says, oh, that sounds like a great idea. That's what he says at the end of verse 4. This is a subtext. It's not what I'm looking for, but a sub-theme is how is the woman treated here in all of this? Is that something that the narrator intentionally threw in there with all these words of taken and required, or is this just something that happened?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Well, I think it's going to come up even more as we go on. So let's look at verses 5 through 11. In the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took Jeconiah of Judah into exile. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah, that is Esther, because she had no father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's command and edict became public knowledge, and when many young women were gathered at the fortress of Susa under Haggai's supervision, Esther was taken to the palace into the supervision of Haggai, keeper of the women. Imagine having the title keeper of the women.
That was my nickname in high school.
Exactly. The young woman pleased him and gained his favor so that he accelerated the process of the beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. He assigned 7 hand-picked female servants to her from the palace and transferred her and her servants to the harem's best quarters. Esther did not reveal her ethnicity or her family background because Mordecai had ordered her not to make them known. Every day, Mordecai took a walk in front of the harem's courtyard to learn how Esther was doing and to see what was happening to her. Lot there, obviously.
That's a lot. That's
That
a
is
lot.
a lot.
So my first question here, and I think it's something we may have brought out last week, I can't remember, is that we get this long genealogy of who Mordecai is. And so
Yep.
I think that's important. And the other thing is, I believe that in Susa, there was 2 parts of Susa. There was kind of the castle Susa, where the king was, and then there was the rest of the town. And so I think it's interesting, how did Mordecai, as a Jew, who we believe had shown his ethnicity to people, how was he that he was in the fortress and not just in the regular part of the ordinary town of Susa? How did he get the recognition to get to be in the palace? I guess is my question. I know we don't know that, but I think it's important to the story of he just appears and now he's this close to potentially the king of Persia to be able to affect what he's going to do later on with the 2 eunuchs.
I mean, don't you think the story kind of tells us exactly why he is where he is? Because this guy's slick. I mean, he is like, it's like, it is Game of Thrones like. It's like, you know,
He's an operator.
he's an operator. He maneuvers well. And so I do wonder if like this guy's been, you know, working the system to try to get into the palace. But I think it's a little bit speculation, but
Well, and that goes to what we've talked about is that, you know, this is why some people don't believe that Esther should be in the canon because it's not Jewish. It doesn't show the Jewry of these 2 characters. They're really acting out of what a normal diaspora story would be. We talked about, I think, Joseph wasn't diaspora. I kind of guess it was, but Joseph, and then you have Daniel, and then there's this extra biblical book of Judith, which is very similar to Esther, where she's very Jewish. She's very righteous in her acts. And here we have Mordecai, who's now kind of rubbing shoulders with the king of Persia. What did he have to do to get there? And what is that saying about the narrators or the writer of Esther saying about this character, and how does that relate to us and God? That was just a small question.
even go. No, I would even go.
Is that a question or is that a statement?
No, that was
Is that
a
a rhetorical question?
No, that was a true question because I don't have an answer. I don't know what it says.
Because this is
about
after the edict that they could go back to Jerusalem. The other question is like, why are there Jews still hanging out?
Yeah. So, I think that's a great point that, you know, why are they still here? Why are they choosing to be in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire that overtook the Babylonian Empire that brought them into captivity when they could go back to Jerusalem? You know,
Okay,
why
this is a serious. I'm sorry. This is a serious statement. I'm not picking on
Yeah.
your tulip here, but
it sounds like it.
Before he even says it, it sounds like it.
Would you have to put a disclaimer on the statement? Just so you know, this is not.
That's right. In New
I mean-
Jersey, when somebody started a sentence with, I don't mean to offend you,
Yeah.
it's like, okay,
Yeah,
just
nice.
look out.
well, my point being is, had God ordained these 2 as such a time as this to stay in Persia to affect the non-annihilation of the Jews. But
Yes.
but by them staying, they would have never been annihilated had Mordecai just bowed. So if he'd have gone back to Judah or Israel, then this would have never happened, right? So
Well,
this is the part to me.
Yeah, well, I think, are they in the moment making choices that they want to do at this time? So they chose themselves to stay in Susa. Is God orchestrating the events around those things to fulfill and to bring to fruition his purposes and plan? Absolutely. So,
Well, even if you look at where the story ends up, because we're talking about like this whole intro to Mordecai, you talked about the genealogy being important. We see that I think it's Mordecai's great grandfather was Kish, which is also in the genealogy of Saul. And so there's a relation there. And so what is God trying to do through having these two people there? Well, we'll see that Haman is an Agagite, right? Or
Yeah.
Agagite, however you
Yep.
say that.
Yep.
So is God also saving the Jews, but also redeeming the situation that Saul messed up in the first place?
what do you want to explain the importance of why this genealogy is here? What's the big deal that they're a descendant of Kish that Saul?
You go ahead. You do that. You're on the track. Keep going.
I mean,
Keep going.
1 Samuel 15. Go ahead and say it.
yeah,
That's
it's
the
1
story,
Samuel
yes.
15.
So Wally's about to explain why these are characters actually represent nations instead of actual people.
Actually, it goes back to Exodus 17, where
That's Tim. That's right.
It's a microcosm.
See what I
of the
did?
greater
See what I did
big
there?
picture.
Love that.
See what you did
I love that.
Kidding.
let's pause for a moment to pray for Tim. It actually goes back to Exodus 17 when the people of Israel are fleeing out of Egypt and are in the desert, and the Amalekites attacked them. And God made a declaration then that, hey, these Amalekites, we're gonna wipe them out. They're not going to be in existence anymore. And so years later, the people of Israel come and they found a nation, and Saul becomes king. And Saul goes into battle with the Amalekites, King Agag, which is a descendant of the Amalekites. And God tells him to totally destroy everything, which is a hard thing, right? Men, women, boys, girl, young, old, animals, everything's to be destroyed. There's nothing to be left. And we hear that Saul and his people, they keep some of the sheep and some of the animals, and they keep alive Agag. And so at this point in time, we know in this story that God, because he was disobedient to God's command, God takes the kingdom away from him and then eventually gives it to David. But here we just see the repercussions of Saul's disobedience to God's command to not destroy the Amalekites, that now we have here a descendant of Kish, which Kish, as we look at, I keep wanting to say quiche.
Hey, can we do spinach?
Quiche.
Can I have some spinach
Hungry.
with that quiche?
I'm acting out of hungriness. So it's important that the writer is drawing those connections in these Old Testament stories. I mean, it's a hyperlink, as we like to talk about, that God's going to bring to fruition his purposes of plan for the people of Israel to be obedient what he asked them to do in Exodus chapter 17, is to totally destroy the Amalekites, to
Okay.
wipe them off the map.
I love that. And so having every commentator makes this connection clearly to 1 Samuel 15 with Agag and Saul. And so and I actually read 1 Samual 15 and 14.
Oh, I'm
today.
all right. Did it prep work?
Really,
That's
look
great.
at it. I actually got the dust off and read it. And so, but it's interesting. You did a great job reviewing that. But why did he not kill the best of the sheep and the goats and the oxen? Why did he not do that? And he makes an explanation when Samuel calls him out on it, because God called him out on it. God calls Samuel to say, go to Saul and tell him that you didn't do what I asked you to do. And Saul's answer was, well, I brought it back. Well, no, I brought it back. And I think he's genuine about this. I brought it back not to save it for me. I brought it back to sacrifice to Yahweh, because I wanted to bring a sacrifice of praise to Yahweh for helping us defeat the Amalekites. How you say it?
Amalekites.
Amalekites. And so I didn't do this for me. I did this for Yahweh. And Samuel's answer is, yeah, probably not.
What was Samuel's?
This is a coffee cup quote. To obey is better than sacrifice.
Yeah.
To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. God doesn't want your sacrifice. God wants your obedience. And so do you think it's intriguing that we have this kind of sub-theme of Saul and Agag going on with Haman and Mordecai, as Riley brought up, of I don't care. I will take care of the Jews' annihilation problem here soon. I want your obedience. And as we just said, I don't think Mordecai is obedient in much in showing the righteousness of Yahweh. Or I could be wrong.
An interesting parallel.
Thank you.
Thoughts?
That really
Thoughts?
wasn't that great of a thought.
I mean,
but
it's
thank you for
interesting.
saying
I
it.
don't have a thought to that, but it's interesting
Yeah.
to bring up.
I mean, there's clearly a lot of hyperlinks, and I think that 1 Samuel 15 is a clear hyperlink. So
If we're judging Mordecai solely of what the writer is talking about his public actions based upon his character, his nature, his willingness to obey God's command and be faithful, then I think that we could see in the scriptures that maybe he isn't all that righteous in his outward actions and what he's going about. But we don't know what, we're just not given a full.
it's just telling the story.
That's right. We don't know the full picture of what happens behind the scenes. We're being let known what the author wants us to be named.
Yeah.
Well, let's
be
make
made
this
known.
let's make this a little relevant then. So I think sometimes somebody had said Machiavellian. I didn't know what that meant, but I think the ends justify the means.
Yes.
And so is it okay, as we're going to go through this story, to see the actions of Mordecai and against Haman? Do the ends justify the means? Do we do things that we think will effectuate something good, even though the act is not righteous?
I think I've heard way too many Christians that will justify corruption, but because of what I typically hear is, but every politician is corrupt, but the means here are better. And one of my questions is always like, no, like as Christians, can't we do both? Can't we fight for both? Can't we fight for the ends, but also in a way that is just, in a way that promotes unity and love rather than hate and pushing other people down? So I think we're kind of forced into that false dichotomy. And I think as Christians have failed, because I think we need to remember, if we're talking about even leadership in our country, it wasn't that long ago when Christians were the one that stood up, particularly I'm thinking like Bill Clinton, of
Yep.
actually character really, really matters. Democrats at that point were like, yeah, but he's a great politician, right?
The argument was if your personal character will affect your public actions, right? And
Right.
So if what you are is flawed as an individual, then you're going to have flawed policies. You're going to have flawed decisions. You're going to have all these issues. And it seems that sometimes they go a little bit quiet when it happens on their side of the aisle.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It
Yeah.
happened with the Democrats. I feel like it's happening right now with Republicans. There's so much corruption. And I do get the line that, but everybody's corrupt. But that doesn't mean it's like moral equivalence either. We have to be able to judge rightly. And whether it's a Democrat, Republican, independent, when an action is not just, when it is not in line with our values, we have to either decide, is this a time for us to speak up, or is it a time to be patient and to wait? Which, we're going to get to that. But even in the passage we just read, you have Esther doing the opposite of what Vashti did, right? Vashti speaks up and says no and protest with a very obvious action.
Well, I think we see here also that God's sovereignty uses all things, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. And so we see throughout Scripture the evil choices of men and evil actions of men, God is orchestrating even in those events to bring about it. I mean, I think about Joseph, right? His brothers are freely choosing at that point to throw him into the pit and to sell him into slavery. But Joseph at the end will say, it was not you who sent me here, but it was God. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We see this throughout Scripture, that God is using the evil choices of men, even in those points, to fulfill his purposes.
So I think we're in agreement then that nobody is we're not trying to justify anybody's actions in the story. And I don't think that we're meant to, although I do know some people will say, no, Esther knew exactly what she was doing. She was kind of doing I'm going to hide my identity so that I can one day protect my people. To me, that is a bit of a reach.
We don't see that in
Because
Scripture.
there was no danger up to this point yet.
Yeah,
Exactly. Comes in chapter 3.
Exactly.
And why is she not revealing her ethnic identity? It's because of what?
Mordecai told her to.
Mordecai's telling her to. Don't tell
But
anybody.
why did Mordecai tell her to do that?
I don't know.
Okay, I mean, I'm just asking the question. That's a fair
evidently
question.
he saw it as a detriment for her being promoted up into the queen.
Well, I know our favorite rabbi, David Foreman,
The
Dr.
Rabbi David Foreman.
the Rabbi David Foreman, would say that it's a very politically savvy move, because when he did the 180-day and then the 7-day banquet in chapter 1, he's doing it probably before the war, getting all the 127 provinces. It's a real number, right, Jonathan?
It's a real number.
He's bringing the nations. And what Foreman says is the king, just like today, represents the nation. Like he is a representative of the nation. And so when he brings out Vashti, I don't know if we talked about this, but the fact that whether she's wearing the crown and clothes or just the crown, it's interesting that they point out the crown, right? In other words, you are representative of, you're an extension of me and therefore an extension of the nation. So for Esther to not reveal her identity, according to Foreman, it's a way of saying, yeah, it doesn't matter where I'm from. I'm Persian. Like, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to represent Persia well. And probably the king, when he was sober, really liked it. He really liked that idea.
Well, let me double down on this.
All right.
Levinson writes a really good commentary, and he's in this section, which I'm going to read you a little bit. He brings in the Kohelet, which I didn't know what that was. The Kohelet is Ecclesiastes. And he talks about how the writer of Esther and the writer of Ecclesiastes would have been contemporaries. He goes into this socio-political dimension of the Book of Esther, and he says, first, it includes no vision of the overthrow of foreign power. Second, that even the dramatic and perhaps miraculous transformation that does take place involves only the squelching of the anti-Semitism, not the restoration of the land of Israel or the reversal of the exile. And so the whole point being here is what you said earlier, Timmy. Why didn't they go back? In fact, Esther's doubling down to say, well, they didn't want to go back. And this doesn't have to do with establishing Israel in their own kingdom again. This has to do with them staying in Persia, in close to power, and only worrying about everybody not being anti-Jew.
But doesn't that just continue to go along with my point, is that even though they did not want to be associated or go back with the Jews to their homeland, that God is still using their selfish decisions to bring about the salvation of those people that actually went back. And then God's people to provide for us eventually, as we will see in the New Testament, that if the Jews are destroyed, then we don't have our Savior, Jesus Christ, come. So
Let me just say one more thing, Ecclesiastes. So this is what he says. It says, the book of Ecclesiastes, in its similar disinterest in cosmic transformation or in the particularities of Jewish religious existence, and its focus instead on the repeating cycles that define the inescapable and unending rhythm of all human life, which is everything is a vapor, everything is smoke. There's nothing that is going to be that transformative, at least on this side of the Mashiach, the Messiah coming back. What is the whole point of man? It's to fear God and keep his commandments, of which I don't think that we see Mordecai and Esther doing here.
So you think that Mordecai might be acting selfishly to get his niece in that place of power and royalty to be able to elevate himself within that culture and society?
You said that earlier. I didn't say that, but I'm saying that the right.
I'm just asking a question.
No. It's a
okay,
good question.
Tucker Carlson.
And so that's a good question. And so that's what I'm saying. What is the narrator doing? Is this intentional? We get this potential reference to Saul and Agag of this sacrifice as opposed to, I'm going to sacrifice who I am for the betterment of the Jewish people. But God's really calling for righteousness and the proper means to do his ends. Because that's what the whole book of Ecclesiastes is about. This is about nothing we can control. We can control nothing about what happens. All we can do is, fear God and trust that what he's going to do is right and it is not going to hurt us. And I think, Wally, to answer your questions, I don't know if this is a personal thing or if he really does feel like there's that anti-Semitism going on with here in Haman in chapter 3, and he's keeping himself close to the power so that he can keep the Jewish people safe. I don't know. But either way, I don't think he's acting righteously. And I still think that's a very important part of the theme here.
I agree.
We see here, as I was looking over some of my notes over this part of the story, we see allusions to Joseph. We see allusions to Daniel. We see how, even though all these circumstances, good or bad, are happening to these individuals, God is still blessing them in spite of those things. Right?
Which is clear in verse 9, where Esther is finding favor with the chief eunuch. which is almost like exactly what we find in Genesis when Joseph finds favor in Potiphar's house. He finds favor in the jail cell. And so you see how, and God is explicitly mentioned in those texts. And so here where God isn't, his name isn't explicitly stated, but we can see him working and moving in the background.
Do you think he put those things in there to be able to make hyperlinks back to these stories, to say, even though God's not mentioned here, I'm going to point you back to these stories in which Daniel was favored and
Joseph
Joseph was, and God is mentioned there.
I totally think so, because I think Joseph is like one of the perfect examples in all of Scripture of a God that is working kind of behind the scenes. You don't always see it, but it's pretty amazing how it all comes together in the end. So I think those hyperlinks are absolutely.
Well, in fact, I mean, I think we mentioned before, the story of Joseph, God is not mentioned, or I should say, God doesn't directly speak in the story of Joseph until Jacob comes back into the scene. And they're going to go, and they're telling Jacob, hey, take the family. It's okay to go back to Egypt. And it's God that's telling Jacob, it's okay. But that's the only time God speaks in that whole story. Now, Joseph gives points and references to God. And he refers to God and gives God credit for the interpretation of dreams and everything else that's happening in his life. But God doesn't directly speak to Joseph in all these things. At least we're not told. It's alluded to, but he directly speaks to Jacob. And here in Esther, it's another good example of allusions to God's not at anywhere spoken about in Esther, but we can absolutely see his hand working in all these stories.
You know why I think we get hung up? When I say we, I mean like the evangelical church today. We get hung up on this question, I think, because we grew up, Riley, I'm not speaking for you. We grew up.
The old men in the room.
The old men in the room grew up with a kind of a moralized Bible, like, okay, here's Esther, be like Esther. Here's Daniel, be like every character. This is like who you aspire to be. And so I think it's just so in us that now I think it's important to explain that, no, just like if a Jew is telling this story, it's their story. And they'll enter into the story, but they will not get hung up on like every like little nuance of like, were they, ordained by God? Were they not ordained by God? With an understanding that God is working through flawed individuals. I think. I could be wrong.
And you never hear anybody say, be like Mordecai, be morally ambiguous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to verses 12 through 18. And Wally, if you can read that for us.
Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil and myrrh, 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young women went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shahashagaz. Thank you. The king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she would be summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity.
And this has been the season finale of Love Island. I mean, well, the thing that comes up to me immediately in that passage, and we've kind of hit on this a little bit, is it seems like there's a comparison in the way that Vashti responds to the whole power dynamic versus what Esther does, where she conceals her identity. And I just find it interesting that Vashti, for her actions, which I think we might look at as being like, man, that's courageous and that's right, she ends up getting banished. Whereas Esther hides her identity and she gets the word again, Riley, favor again, pops up here as well. I'm No comment there, other than I just find that really intriguing, especially when you have so many themes of reversal in Esther. There's another one where it's like, okay, the actions don't play out necessarily the way that you would think they would. Thoughts?
Oh, you're looking at me, aren't you? I have plenty of thoughts, and again, I think it still goes to the comic portion of this. It's almost like it's like this fairy tale, and don't take the fairy tale, Wally, it's not historical narrative, but the fairy tale of this is you've got someone that is doing the right thing in her culture and gets banished. You get someone doing unrighteous in her culture, and she's getting promoted. And it's like, where is God in all of this? Does Yahweh not support those that are acting righteously as opposed to who's acting unrighteously for his benefit, for Yahweh's benefit? And I think that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. I don't know that I know the point yet because I haven't really finished my thought and meditation on all this. But I think that is a theme for me, a major theme in this book, is that you have somebody that's not acting Jewish, that is Jewish, that's hiding the Jewishness, but supposedly is using it for the betterment of all Jews. To me, it's just the same story that we see in 1 Samuel 15 with Saul and Agag. He's trying to do the right thing for Yahweh, even though he wasn't asked to do it. That wasn't his purpose. His purpose was to follow what he was supposed to do. And so is this a point that they're trying to say that Yahweh's even going to look back at the comic foolishness of our actions, kind of like we see in Ecclesiastes, and he's still going to effectuate what he wants in the end? You're not puppets, but don't act so silly, because he is going to effectually do what he wants in the end, and you don't have to worry about that. Just do what I tell you to
Basically,
do.
he's going to work despite all your silliness.
That's right. Is that what the narrator's doing in here? Is like, these are the reversals you're going to see over and over. The good person the good team wins at the end, I guess. But is that the point of Esther? Is it that we're watching this comic play of how everybody's maneuvering, and it doesn't really benefit or bring detriment to either? The Jews were safe in the beginning. The Jews are safe at the end.
Is there a fear that, and I don't disagree with anything you said, but is there a fear that can lead to this idea of, well, if God's in control and he's sovereign and he's going to do whatever he wants to do anyway, I can kind of do whatever I want.
Or feudalistic, so I don't have to do anything.
Yeah,
I disagree. I think that's Ecclesiastes. That's what I was just reading. I said, the whole book of Ecclesiastes is where you're going to do what you want to do, eat, drink, and be merry, and do all this stuff. But ultimately, it's all a vapor. You can't control any of it. So why are we here? And he says to fear God and keep his commandments. That's why we're here. We're just here to worship and not take control of things, but trust God in the story of what he's trying to create for us and for the community around us.
And why they are here in this point in this story is because of one person's disobedience to God's commands by Saul, right? I mean, the reason that we are here in this place right here this time is why the author keeps pointing us to these other biblical allusions that happened earlier in the history of Jews. He says, the reason we're here now is because Saul was disobedient then. And there's repercussions.
But you can go on to say Solomon was disobedient in intermarrying with other nations. That's why he got stripped, and that's why the nations got split, and that's why they got taken over, because, it's one story of disobedience after another. No one feared God or kept his commandments. They were all looking at what they wanted.
And what's been constant throughout all those in God's response to his people? Patience, steadfast love. When we were talking about the story of Jonah, about I'm faithful to 1,000 generations, that formulaic understanding that God declares about himself, that I am steadfast, I am all these things. And these are things that in the Old Testament, the Old Testament is always seen as a place of judgment, and God's a God of hate and just wrath and thunder. But we see the immensity of God's grace and patience and long suffering with his people. He could have acted a lot earlier and been justified, and he's always justified in what he does and when he does it. But he would have been justified if he dealt with Solomon and the kingdom right then and there.
Yeah.
But his grace was just
so interesting. I think the obedience piece is huge, because when you take a step back from the whole story, you see with all the politicking, you see people that are not trusting God necessarily. They're trying to control things themselves. And, we'll talk about this verse when we get to it more, but like, if you'll remember, at one point, Esther is told, hey, if you don't do this, it's going to come another way anyway, which goes back to Jonathan's point of, what our actions are almost beside the point. It's about obedience, pure and simple. So That's a lot. We've hit a lot in 40 some odd minutes. We did not get to the end of the chapter, which is okay. We will pick up next time with verse 19. Hope this has been good for you. Have a great week, everyone. We will see you next time.